Surprisingly, in Overlord, Doppelgangers are one of the few races whose abilities are fairly well defined and explained. So unlike last time, where we talked about various historical influences on Pandora's Actor that weren't entirely related to Overlord itself, this time we're going to dive deep into the facts of the novel. So join me as we take a look at everything from his build and abilities to a very extensive breakdown as to what exactly a doppelganger is, to hopefully answer the question in the title by not actually answering the question at all. How strong is Pandora's Actor? Before we start though, just the usual quick plug of my Overlord merch. You can get the Nazarick emblem and succubate shirts from the Teespring link in the description. Now, let's begin. If we start with his build, Pandora's Actor has 45 levels dedicated to racial classes, with 15 in Doppelganger, 10 more in Greater Doppelganger, then the remaining 20 are unknown. Just like all the other heteromorphic races, being a doppelganger gives you access to a full racial class tree, and you gain the ability to choose from a multitude of subvariants as you level. So Doppelganger would seem to be the first, then Greater Doppelganger after that, and beyond that, in the remaining unknown 20 levels, is a possibility of even more powerful variants. As I'm throwing the word doppelganger around, there is the chance that many of you may not even know what a doppelganger is, so allow me to give you a bit of insight into the term. The word originates from mid-19th century Germany as a descriptive term for paranormal apparitions, or beings, that appear identical to another living person. The word itself is a combination of two nouns, with doppel meaning double and ganger meaning walking. In this classical sense, a doppelganger isn't someone that transforms as we're familiar with. It's closer to a creature that was born as an identical clone. But as a popular term in fantasy games, it's frequently used to refer to mythological creatures who can adopt the form of others. Though they aren't just mere shapeshifters who can assume an alternate form. They actively mimic other individuals, typically for nefarious purposes, meaning that not only can they transform into other creatures and imitate their appearance, but they can also copy their capabilities. Special attacks, spells, racial abilities. In their new form, a doppelganger has access to pretty much anything the original has access to. This is no mere lookalike. No, this is a full-on transformation. When transformed, they gain all the benefits and drawbacks of their new form, as if their new form was their regular. Both racial weaknesses and racial advantages are adopted, and their base stats are even adjusted to be equivalent to the original. The only thing a doppelganger can't imitate is special equipment and gear. While they can look as if they are wearing the gear if need be, this is merely for appearances only, and they don't gain any of its benefits or stat boosts. That being said, the doppelganger can always simply wear the equipment in question if they can somehow obtain it. As a matter of fact, doppelgangers can bypass any race or class restrictions on the gear in question. Some gear can only be worn by, say, dwarves or birdmen. Some weapons can only be wielded by warriors, others only by mages. But a doppelganger can ignore all these limitations and restrictions, though it's not clear whether they innately ignore all restrictions regardless of what form they assume, or whether they have to assume the form of a being with a particular race or class in order to utilize particular pieces of equipment restricted to that race or class. Now, as I go on to further speak of the finer details on the doppelganger race, just remember that they all apply to Pandora's Actor. Though I may not be talking about him explicitly, it's still just as relevant. So moving on. Doppelgangers, unlike shapeshifters, must imitate a specific form belonging to someone else. They cannot make modifications to the form, nor can they create their own, meaning it has to be a form belonging to someone else, and it can only be imitated exactly. It's possible that they must first witness, meet, or study the individual in question before they can transform into them. But a doppelganger's imitation is moderately dependent upon the perception that others have on the form that they've chosen. Once transformed, a doppelganger actively reads the surface thoughts of those who knew the person being imitated, and it uses that to subtly adjust its behavior and appearance to match the expectations that they have. And when I say surface thoughts, I'm actually referring to a limited telepathy effect that doesn't quite go to the extent of reading a person's past memories or really accessing their subconscious, but it's more simply listening to the voice in their head, their surface thoughts. Thus, a doppelganger is ironically most effective against the people who knew that person extremely well, since they would have the most accurate perceptions. It's quite the interesting tactic to refine one's imitation, and I'm sure Pandora's Actor excels at it given his high-level genius. Now, being aware of this basic telepathy, it's not really surprising that the greatest threat to a doppelganger is a crowd or party, as it may have difficulty melding all of their expectations together or discerning which individuals have the most reliable and accurate understanding of the person that they're meant to imitate. If everyone in a large group hates them out of prejudice rather than personal first-hand experience, they may act out of character in an attempt to reinforce that prejudice. Then, close friends who later hear of the events might grow suspicious that their buddy was acting all weird. Even more so, since the reading of surface thoughts is a form of attack, it can be resisted or outright negated by immunities, such as Ainz's passive undead immunity to mind-affecting attacks. Now you may be wondering, how the hell did this work in the world of Yggdrasil? Because the last time I checked, video games didn't let you listen to people's thoughts. Well, all of this was merely a footnote in the bestiary lore entry in the game, but after having migrated to the New World, it became an active and functional mechanic. Presumably, in the game, you could use doppelgangers to imitate other players to trick their friends and guildmates, or to beat certain quests, or even just as a versatile generalist who can cover multiple roles. Let's shift to a bigger question now. Who and what exactly can a doppelganger imitate at each level? A standard doppelganger, which maxes out at 15 levels, can imitate any creature up to level 40. A greater doppelganger, which maxes out at an additional 10 levels, can imitate any creature up to level 60. Incidentally, you can distinguish between the two based on the number of fingers that they have on each hand in their doppelganger form. Greater doppelgangers have 4, and regular doppelgangers have 3. And since Pandora's Actor is able to imitate creatures up to level 100, namely all of the supreme ones, there are presumably more powerful doppelganger types. And once again, presumably, that's what the rest of his 20 or so racial levels are dedicated to, though he still only has 4 fingers per hand. Perhaps there's a hidden doppelganger level above these ones that maxes out at 5 levels, similar to Ainz's Overlord. Maybe something like an ultra or super doppelganger. Even a lesser doppelganger below the standard one would allow us to make more sense of this. I mean, the possibility seems relatively balanced. If a lesser doppelganger requires 15 levels, then it can imitate creatures up to level 20. Then the standard would require another 15 racial levels and bring us up to 30, while allowing for imitations up to level 40. Then the greater doppelganger would bring us up to 40 racial levels, while allowing for an imitation up to level 60. And finally, the super ultra doppelganger, which costs another 5 racial levels, brings us to Pandora's 45, and would allow for that imitation up to any level. Alternatively, perhaps the first 60 levels are just relatively easy to imitate, and the remaining 40 require certain specializations to achieve. For instance, there could very well be doppelganger variants or subtypes that are specialized towards improving specific forms over others. If that was the case, then there's probably a doppelganger subrace that specializes in imitating heteromorphs, and can break past that normal level limit of 60 that greater doppelgangers have. But once again, only when imitating heteromorphs due to that special subvariant. Though this is just speculation. Those last 20 racial levels could very well be anything, but given the fact that he can imitate level 100 beings, we can be certain that it is some kind of doppelganger. Now, you might be thinking, doppelgangers sound incredibly broken, but there are actually a good deal of limitations and drawbacks. Obviously, I've already explained the weaknesses of being unable to replicate equipment, and as it is with any MMO, equipment can change everything. Just look at Ainz's fight with Shaltir.
Be gone!
So, by default, a doppelganger is much less capable than what they're imitating unless they already have comparable equipment for themselves. Another potential limitation could be the number of transformations permitted per day, though it's not too clear whether one actually exists, or if there's even a time limit on the duration of the transformation itself. But most special abilities like this do impose some kind of threshold. This is important for 2 reasons. First, if you have to switch repeatedly or use up time, you may eventually run out, and you'll become stuck in a particular form for an extended period of time, or even revert to your lesser doppelganger form. Second, there are actually certain spells that can revert or disable a doppelganger's shapeshifting ability. We're not given any specific name or their level, but apparently Ainz knows that a few of them exist. Lower leveled variations simply revert them to their doppelganger form. forcing them to spend time and potentially one of their limited daily uses to transform back. While stronger variations not only revert them, they also disable further transformations for an extended amount of time. And doppelgangers in their base form are quite weak, much weaker than similar units of their level. So during the time that they're in their doppelganger form, they're actually quite vulnerable and pretty useless. Of course, wasting time to cast such a spell on a hunch that a person that you're with is actually a doppelganger can give your enemy the advantage, so it's not very practical to use it every fight. Okay, so it may seem like a nice exploit to create an army of level 45 doppelganger NPCs and have them go around imitating level 100 guards, but if you were to fight a foe that knows or suspects that your army is made up of doppelgangers, a single spell can turn your army into a giant XP farm. Though it's highly doubtful that anyone in the New World knows or has access to such spells, so Pandora's Actor himself should be fine. Furthermore, though not confirmed, I suspect that there's an additional limitation placed on doppelgangers, namely that they can't transform into anything that's a higher level than they are. Also, it would seem that by extrapolating a bit of information from the light novel, the total number of forms that a doppelganger has access to seems to be dependent on their level, though once again, it's not stated explicitly in the light novel. It's not as if they can just copy anyone they've ever seen at any time. They only have a limited number that they can choose from at any given moment. As a matter of fact, since Nabe only has one form other than her normal doppelganger appearance and one level of doppelganger, while Pandora's Actor has 45 forms and 45 levels of we assume to be doppelganger, from this it would seem that you gain one additional form for each level of doppelganger that you obtain. Naturally, you'd assume that these weren't permanent choices that took up a transformation slot forever, but whether you could swap them out for others or not is still not clear. I mean, it wouldn't really make sense to not be able to swap out forms, especially if you're leveling up early on in the game and have a low-level form that you want to replace with a stronger one. After all, Yggdrasil did have a global respec mechanic, and you can use that to quickly remove 5 levels that you didn't like. You could very easily gain those 5 levels back relatively quickly due to the way that XP was tuned. Most players got to level 100 pretty fast, and the bulk of your power was dependent on gear, build, and tactics, so players didn't really mind dying as a method of respecking. So if there actually was no method of replacing old forms that you didn't like with new ones manually, then you could simply die and lose access to 5 forms along with the 5 levels that you lost. Of course, this option isn't so easily mimicked in the New World. You don't just automatically respawn back in some kind of safe zone. You have to be resurrected with a spell of at least level 5 or higher, and very few denizens outside of Nazarick have access to such spells. The last and probably most important limitation is that a doppelganger's imitation isn't perfect. While they can imitate all of the abilities of a creature, their efficacy with said abilities is reduced relative to the original. I'm going to be pulling out a few numbers right now, so I'll try to make this as easily digestible as possible. But specifically, while a greater doppelganger can imitate creatures up to level 60, its actual abilities are only around 80 to 90% as potent as the original. For example, Pandora's Actor can imitate the guild members of Ainz, a selection of level 100 creatures, but with only 80% of their potency. Base stats such as HP, MP, physical attack, physical defense, agility, and resistances are changed to be equal to the original. But the actual output of any special ability or attack is 20% less. Now, at first glance, that doesn't seem like a significant drawback. A 20% penalty in exchange for being able to imitate 45 different creatures seems reasonable. You can be an ultra-specialized crafter, or a spellcaster, or a warrior with a perfectly optimal and hyper-specialized build, then fill basically any role, but also be able to ignore any downsides or limitations at will by transforming into something else. And all it costs is a measly 20% potency reduction. Right? Well, it's not quite as simple as it sounds. First of all, it's hard to predict what a 20% reduction in attack power or defense actually leads into in terms of damage output or survivability. After all, attack power and defense interact with each other. So let's take a look at a simple example and do some quick maths. Say my special attack does 1000 damage per hit, and my defensive skill blocks 800 damage. If I was fighting someone with identical stats to myself, I'd do 200 damage per hit to them, and they'd deal 200 damage to me. But if I'm fighting against a doppelganger with only 80% potency on their skills identical to mine, then that means the total damage they do with their attack is 800, and their defensive skill is now only able to block 640 damage. If they were to hit me now, their 800 damage goes up against my 800 defense and does 0 damage each hit, whereas if I hit them, my 1000 attack versus their 640 defense means I now do 360 damage per hit. Consider for a moment the implications of that. A mere 20% debuff means that they'll now take 80% more damage than if they weren't a doppelganger but still had identical stats to me. And their 20% lower attack means they'll essentially do no damage, and I'm standing here laughing like Kirito on that bridge. So from this basic example, we see a 20% difference in the input leads to a well over 80% difference in the output. While Yggdrasil probably operates on a much more complicated damage formula, as most games tend to do, since we don't know exactly what it is, it's extremely difficult to determine what 20% lower potency actually translates to. You can apply a similar logic to a lot of other things. For instance, what does 80% potency mean when applied to things like instant death spells? Does it reduce the chances of success? If so, how does that work? What's the formula for calculating the chances of inflicting a negative status effect on an opponent? Does it scale based on a spell potency variable, which is reduced by an enemy's resistance or agility stat? So if I go from 1000 spell potency to 800 spell potency versus the enemy's 900 resistance stat, then what are the chances that my debuff is now successful? Perhaps it could be something as simple as if I initially had a 50% chance of causing instant death, then an 80% potency would reduce that to a 40% chance because of the way that probabilities work. There's just a whole bunch of variables that need to be considered. For the sake of simplicity, let's just assume that the actual overall output of any activity will work out to be 80% of the original, meaning a fixed 20% penalty on whatever, regardless of the situation. So when Pandora's Actor uses a defensive skill, it's only around 80% as good at reducing damage. When he attacks, he's only doing 80% as much damage. When he's trying to dodge or resist a spell, he's only dodging it 80% as often. When he's trying to inflict a debuff or crowd control, he's only successful 80% as often. And when he tries to heal, he only heals for 80% as much damage. And that's that. So how significant are all those penalties in a fight? Well, in my initial example, you saw for yourself by the numbers how much of a difference that 20% really makes. Which leads us into the next question. What if a doppelganger gets into a fight with its original? With the two of them trading special attacks back and forth while trying to block and dodge with special abilities. Well, since the doppelganger would only deal around 80% as much damage on offense and would negate around 80% damage on defense, the total penalty would actually come out to be 64%, since they're applied to separate aspects of the fight. The penalties stack, meaning there's the less damage he does overall in combination with the increased damage that he's taking. So to answer the question, by the math, you can fight a doppelganger of yourself and easily beat it with more than a third of your HP left. That said, this example is heavily abstracted, simplified, and generalized. It assumes a very simple fight where they take turns slapping each other with attacks and constantly trying to block or dodge. It doesn't factor in tactics or strategy or special abilities, which could swing the fight radically in one direction or another. Even if you are weaker, if you can ambush your enemy, then it doesn't matter nearly as much. I also don't factor in the impact of crowd control or disables. Hell, Ainz himself has spells which instantly kill the target if they aren't resisted. Like, if you're dead, you can't fight anymore. Of course, the key to figuring all of this out would be what exactly 80% potency means in these cases. Furthermore, there's nothing stopping a doppelganger from changing into a form that gives it a significant advantage over the person it's imitating. And there's a lot of different situations where penalties to particular stats aren't nearly as important. If you transform into a stealthy archer or a ranged attacker and snipe them from a distance while in stealth, you might just be able to get multiple hits off and outright kill them before they can even react. Or you can just rain down artillery on them using heavy bombardment magic. If you're just planning on doing these hit and run tactics, it doesn't matter nearly as much that you have less defensive abilities than someone else. The only thing that really matters in that type of situation is that you do less damage. And it's not like you even need to use a doppelganger to fight. They can imitate craftsmen to build and smith gear, then switch to alchemy and build and make lots of powerful potions, then switch over to a divination build and recon the enemy, then switch to a commander that's built to buff everyone, and then switch back to a combat build to actually fight. Of course, they'll just be 20% worse at these things, whatever that means. But as you can tell, there's definitely a lot of things that need to be considered when talking about this reduced potency effect of imitation. Once again, how does it apply to buffs and disables? Does it reduce both the magnitude of the effect and the duration? What about the number of uses or the MP cost? And what about healing? What does it really look like if I only heal 80% as much as a properly built healer? Does that just mean that I have to spend more mana to heal that same amount of HP? Those of you who have ever played an MMO know that it's not that simple. Put aside the complicated considerations of overhealing and MP sustain for just a second. You know that if you can't keep pace with the incoming damage as a healer, a single person dropping can lead to a chain reaction of events that just results in a devastating party wipe. Anyway, my whole point regarding all of this is that penalties can actually stack together in unexpected ways and end up being a lot more significant than just 20%. A doppelganger could be massively inferior, or just slightly worse than whatever specialist that they happen to be imitating. It's all situational. But at the end of the day, what a doppelganger sacrifices in raw capability, they make up for in versatility and flexibility. Their form of imitation can round out any party or fill any role. Mechanically speaking, they're less suited for established guilds, and more for solo play or pickup groups. Their use in something like guild combat is exactly what you expect, for deception. They look and play close enough to the original that they can fool the unsuspecting. You can make your forces look more powerful than they really are by mixing in NPC doppelgangers. You could imitate your opponents and trick their friends and guildmates into giving you intel or free stuff. Yggdrasil is a game of information and deception. Ambushes, tactics, and strategy matter a lot more than just raw power. But I think that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. That's pretty much all the stuff on doppelgangers. But we're only halfway through explaining Pandora's Actor's powers and abilities. So be sure to join me next time for part 2 of part 2. Very quickly, before I go once again, don't forget that the Succubate shirts are available through the link in the description. They're a great way to help support what I do here, while getting something that I hope is nice in return. But yeah, thank you for Djinnfor as usual for doing the research on this, thank you guys for watching, and as usual, if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!